I'm Steve Shusett, the relatively new stated clerk for Highlands Presbytery. And like I said, it's good to see some of you, or at least see your names when I've only seen your names and not really known if you were there before. And I'm glad you could join us for this time today. There's a lot to cover, but I also want to take the questions and comments and advice that you have. So if you raise your hand, I am thinking Zoom will bring you to the top of my screen, but if not, just unmute yourself and interrupt me. But if you could keep in mind, we have a lot to cover. So if you can keep, especially the advice and comments on the briefer side, that'll help us get more and more of those in. In 1985, the Presbyterian Church USA took on a document, a confession that was written in one of our predecessor denominations. It was not voted on to become part of our book of confessions, but it is lifted up as a contemporary statement of faith, a reliable aid for Christian study, liturgy, and inspiration. And in that, it said this. Let's see if I can shrink this a little. There we go. Jesus Christ stands at the center of the biblical record. And that's from a brief statement or a declaration of faith. The Bible is a record of God's good work. It's more than a record, but it is a record all the same. And a record is an important thing. So what I would like to have us do is have a quick recap of the book of Esther. Let's see if I can. One of the realities of my life is that late last year, I had some damage to one of my nerves in my neck. And as a consequence, my voice can be a little ragged sometimes, and I've got to kind of be mindful of using it. So I'm going to ask for volunteers to do things today. So don't fall asleep too fast. Many of you are probably familiar with the book of Esther, but I'm also sure that some of you are not. So a very quick recap is the king banishes the queen because she is mean to him. And so he kicks her out, but he's a king, he needs a queen. And so he has what amounts to a beauty contest to see who the most beautiful woman is, because apparently that's all you need to be queen. And there's a man named Mordecai, and Mordecai has a very beautiful niece whose name is Esther. And so he suggests that she put herself in the beauty pageant, but don't tell anybody you're Jewish because people here don't like Jews. And so keep that quiet, but you're beautiful, give it a shot. And so sure enough, Esther becomes the queen. In the midst of all of this, an interesting moment happens, and I am going to ask for a volunteer, I think I'm going to have to shrink you again, to read this passage. So do I have a volunteer that I can't see because I can't do all of these things at once? Any volunteers to read from Esther 2?
I can read.
Thank you.
Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King.
Ahasuerus.
I'm not good with the names.
No, that's okay.
Bible.
I'll jump in with those. Ahasuerus.
And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king.
Okay. So a lot happens in this book, too much to cover, well worth reading if you have the time. But you can see that Mordecai spills the beans on a plot against the king. Well, now there becomes a plot against the Jewish people, and that becomes a big issue, as one might expect. And the Jewish people are at the brink of extinction. They don't know it yet, but it's about to happen. But then the following happens. And if we could have another volunteer. And if you're volunteering, you can just start.
I can do it.
Thank you.
On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him."
Now, you probably had to look over your minutes to fill out the minute review form. You may have even reviewed someone else's minutes. And no offense, but if you read through one set of minutes or a couple of sets of minutes, you can probably see why just reading a year's worth of minutes would probably help you fall asleep if you were having trouble. No offense to anybody. I'm sure all of your minutes have been incredibly exciting. I know our Presbytery minutes are like a novel. But here we have the king who is having trouble sleeping, and he asked to have the minutes brought to him, but he doesn't fall asleep. Instead, he remembers something that he had forgotten, and he realizes that some important things have been left incomplete. And so the rest of the book of Esther is all about how this king is led to show gratitude, which in turn leads to saving the Jewish people, that in turn leads to Jesus, that in turn leads to you and I being here in the church, being here today as followers. And all of that is because someone kept good minutes, and they knew how to find them. They knew where their minute book was. They kept good records, and people knew what happened, and they knew what hadn't happened. And all of that is because someone just like you kept good minutes, paid attention. Now, it can feel like all you're doing is taking minutes on something. But the truth is, those minutes mean something. There are times when we need to look back and go, what happened? Did we do it? Did we do it right? How could we do it differently? And when we think about it that way, not only do we realize how important it is, but many of us will feel like, I don't know if I'm up to doing this. And so if I could have another volunteer to read. There we go. This next quotation. Would someone read this from Mark Silver, The Heart of Business?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
You can find confidence wherever you are standing. When you're new and doing something, you can have confidence if you can be humble. If I can let go of attachment of, I need to do it right, or I need somehow to be a big person, or I need to be more than I am. If I can just show up and say, I'm just a humble, small person. I'm just trying to do this new thing that I may or may not know how to do, and that I may or may not be super good at. And if I can show up as I am and make promises and commitments on where I am actually standing, not trying to make bigger promises or bigger commitments than I can authentically make, then I can have the confidence of being in that.
Thank you. In thinking about this morning and having Tricia Dykers-Koenig come and join us today, I was led to thinking about, and actually a call I got yesterday from the General Assembly, thinking about my own role as a stated clerk. This is the second time I've been a stated clerk. It's probably the 5th year I have been a stated clerk. So I've been doing this for a while. But I realized I am much more comfortable doing the organizing, tracking, working with Sonia to make sure the minutes are in, making sure our reports are in on time. Much more comfortable with that than what our guest today is well known for. If you watched any of the General Assembly online, Tricia was the person by the moderators who, if someone said, can we do this? She would be the one to go, well, according to D11 1.02-1, no, you can't. And she wasn't looking at the book. She just knew that. I am not all that comfortable doing that part. And fortunately, in the life of a congregation, and so far in Highlands Presbytery, we haven't needed to do that stuff. She's a rock star in the church. Everybody knows who Tricia is. But you know what? Everybody knows who Chris Valerius is in denominational work. She's the woman who called me yesterday, and she's the one who works with the statistical reports. And she works with things like e-minister when you get a new pastor. Those things are just as important, and people who know her love her, but it's a different kind of emphasis in the life of a clerk. And of course, we're all called to do both those things, but to have confidence where you are and to know that we're a big church and you can always call me, you can always call a neighboring clerk and say, how do I do this? This is different, or I haven't experienced this before. That's why we're a connectional church, so that we can all be together on those things. Mark Silver, I heard these words before you on a podcast. His heart of business is a business that works with people from a ethical, faithful perspective. He's an entrepreneur, he's a coach, a consultant. Well, the work of a clerk is very much administrative. It's very business-like. Mark Silver could understand what we do, even if he might not understand what other people in the church do. The clerk's ministry is very business-like, but it doesn't make it any less of a ministry, because ministry is any work we do for God's sake. You can build a house because you want to build a house, or you're a contractor. You can build a house with a sense of this is for a greater good, and you might call it Habitat for Humanity. But any of those can be a ministry if you're doing it for God and for God's sake. And that includes the church business that we're responsible for. So let us pray. Loving God, who created us in your image, we give you thanks for these who are called to the ministry of clerk in your church. Just as you empowered the church with the gift of your Spirit, so enable these your servants to help our congregations run smoothly, day in and day out. Like Jesus's mother at the wedding of Cana, may they know what needs to be done, when and by whom, and Christ-like in the giving and building up of the church in which they minister. We ask you to bless them with wisdom and patience that they need, and with a joy-filled heart in all that they do. It is in the name of Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, we pray. Amen. Okay. What would be nice, now that we're all together, Mark Silver said, every act of business can be an act of love and still be effective. And I hope that that's true for your business as a clerk. So this is a new experience for me, so thank you for your patience. I am going to I'm sure there's an easier way to do what I'm doing, but this is the best I can figure. Little class participation. You ready? Oh, great. Some of you are diving in already. Taking notes with pen or paper or on the computer. Okay, so we have 75%, 76% doing it, as my friend says, the analog way with pen and paper. He would pull out his pad of paper and say, I brought my analog computer. Let's try this. Can you put your hands on your congregation's past session minutes and membership rolls within 30 minutes of walking in the church? "82% can, and the 18% who can't, I hope you can find them in more than 30 minutes, but less than 24 hours. How about that? How much experience do you have as a clerk of session? So we have a couple of people with a lot of experience, a number of people with a good bit of experience, but quite a few who are relatively new. So I'm glad you're here with us today. And have you connected with another clerk of session or with me over the past year? I didn't put that in, but because again, we are a connectional church. One of our greatest assets is we aren't doing this alone. And that isn't true of every church. Every church has to have a business meeting of some kind, but not every church has someone that they can call, in a neighboring church and say, how do you do this? Because they might all do it differently. Whereas we all have to do it pretty much the same. Well, okay, so a relatively even split on that one. Well, if you haven't needed to call out, I'm glad things have gone so smoothly. And if you have needed to call out, but you haven't, well, I hope you'll reach out to one of those folks who's used to being in contact with other people on these things. Okay. We'll get back to some more of these polls in just a little bit. So let me pull this PowerPoint back up. Can you tell I've been blessed to have other people around helping me do PowerPoint stuff all this time? Or doing Zoom stuff, I should say.
I'm smiling, right?
I'm guessing you are, yeah. Hopefully I won't get too bad a review from you when All right. As I said, today is not about being perfect. Perfect is the enemy of the good. And I've written to any number of you or spoken to a few of you to say, if you get exceptions on your review, don't take it personally. I'm not saying you're a bad person. We're just saying some things could be better. And that's really all we ask. If it has to be perfect or you're going to quit, well, I don't want you to quit. So I have to ask you to give up on being perfect. But you can get better. And this image before you, Sankofa, comes from the Twi language of Ghana, and it means to go back and get. The picture is of a bird looking backwards with an egg in its mouth, and it's trying to say it's not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. We all need to look back on the past so we can do better in the future. And that's what clerks are doing with churches, and that's how clerks need to see themselves as folks who are always getting better at things, but we get better by looking back. Where we're going to go with this today is using the minute review form as an overview for the work that the clerk does, because the review form covers most of the essential tasks we have to do. But I know that from some presbyteries, this has not been a common occurrence. And some of the things have changed from last year to what you'll be expected to do reviewing this year's minutes. So I thought I'd use that as kind of a template for us. You have already received this review form. You've gotten it through email. It's been online. You can see how to track it down. And Sonia's here listening. You can always call Sonia because she can get it to you. When we have done things in the past, we have had this asterisk business, and we are doing away with the asterisk. If it's on the form, it's important. And so if you haven't done it, it means it hasn't been done. The way the schedule works is Easter this coming year in 2023 will be April 9th. You can expect a couple of weeks after that, we will send something out to remind you, okay, you need to get your minutes into us. And you'll have about a couple of weeks to do that. And then we aim for 5 to 6 weeks of letting you review the minutes that you swap so that you can be done before the summer and you can forget about all this. But it's kind of on you to have all those things done. And we'll talk about how you can do that efficiently. And there has been some conversation that in some regions, we might see if people want to get together personally next year instead of doing it online. And that's, we can work that out, especially if some of you indicate your interest in doing it that way. But in any case, when you get to the form itself, you'll see that there's now just page numbers and comments. There aren't really a lot of yes and no things, because if you put a page number in, that means yes. And if you don't put a page number in, that means no. Unless in the comments section, you explain why it is you don't have a page number. And so when it comes to the dates for the celebration of the Lord's Supper, you can see someone plugged in those page numbers. You can look on page 3 and see exactly where it happened. Your job as the clerk for your minutes is to fill out this form in advance. And I know we have some new folks who sent in a blank form, and you were new, and so I understand. But if you're here, then you're not that new. And so we'll hope that next year you'll do that, because it makes life so much easier. And I say that as someone who has to review minutes that don't have page numbers on them on the review form, and it's just page by page. And honestly, if someone said there were no page numbers on it, I'm not going to review this, I wouldn't blame them, and I'd probably send it back to the person who didn't fill out the form. So you can see here's the page numbers for celebrating the Lord's Supper. No longer is a blank just left blank. You've got to put something in it. So that would be an exception, that you didn't tell us that you have a baptized member's roll. Just tell us you got it. In the same way, not applicable doesn't cut it. Tell us why it's not applicable. You didn't have any baptisms in 2022. You didn't elect new, or you didn't install new elders or deacons in 2022 because you got permission from COM not to have to do that. Everything is applicable. It's just some things you don't do or you do. As I said, we're done with the asterisk. If it's there, it's important. I try to be fair. I give a lot of discretion to the reader. If the reader reads it and feels like this is an exception or it isn't, I'll look it over, and if I can see how they got that, then I'll go with it. Excuse me. But again, if you get an exception, don't take it too hard. It's an opportunity to do better. Again, Mark Silver, when you're new and doing something, you can have confidence if you can be humble, if you can let go of the attachment of, I need to do it right, or I need to somehow be a big person, or I need to be more than I am. Just show up and say, I'm trying to do it, doing the best I can, and have confidence in that. One of the things, if you've looked at the new review form that is new, is if you tell me twice on 2 different pages that you open the meeting with prayer, I'm going to take that as a pattern. I'm going to trust you that you're not just going to pray in January and February and not pray the rest of the year. But so it makes it simple, but I hope you can see that these things are, you can just have these things ready, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You just need to click these things off, and it doesn't have to be too big a deal. 2 page numbers, that's all I'm asking for. Just tell us what type of meeting it is. Is it a stated meeting, which means you always meet on the 3rd Thursday of the month? Or is it a called meeting or a special meeting, as the Book of Order puts it, where you weren't planning to meet, but you've got to decide whether to cut a tree down. And so you call a meeting, you have a special meeting. You have to give us the church name. Every once in a while, I come across a set of minutes where we don't really know where, it doesn't say on it where it's from. And we're not just doing this for us today, and we're not just doing this for your church. And so 500 years from now, someone may wonder why that tree was cut down, and they don't know where to look. They don't know what the church name is, or they see a tree was cut down, but they don't know what church it happened in. So put that in. Where did you meet in the church? The date, the time, who was present and who was absent. And that's important, because if someone says, you know, we voted on this last month, but I've kind of been thinking about it and I'd like to change my mind, we've got to make sure they were there. And then they'll then be able to tell you whether or not they voted for it or not, because that's the only way they can reconsider it. If they weren't there, then it didn't happen for them. They just aren't a part of that decision. Your moderator's name, your guests, mark down that you had a quorum. You don't have to tell us what your quorum number is. Just tell us you had one. Is Laura Zidgel here from Myersville? Laura, are you here? Guess not. Well, I wanted to give a shout out to Laura because these are taken from her minutes. And I just really appreciated, this was it, month after month after month. And you can do this in advance. And all you have to do the night of the meeting is fill in present, absent. We called the meeting to order at 7:30 instead of 7:35. You have Reverend Aspinall opening the meeting. She's already been marked as the moderator. But if I'm called in because she couldn't be there and you needed a moderator, then you can plug my name in. You've got the agenda, you've got the minutes being corrected, and then you start with the rest of the correspondence and communication. You can just have this as a template ready to use every meeting. And I've seen people who do the same thing. They'll write it out, because some people do it by paper and pen. They'll write this out, they'll use the church copy machine, and they'll just print up the front page of their minutes. And then they just have to plug in the information each time. Keep in mind, it says a quorum was present. If there's no quorum, there's no meeting. You can talk all you want. None of your actions are authentic or authorized unless you have a quorum. And because this does come up occasionally, and I hope it never does in any of your situations, if there is no moderator, there is no meeting. And you really shouldn't even meet to chat about things when the moderator isn't there. And so sometimes when there's division in a church, people will meet and will talk, but there's no moderator. If there's a problem, the healthiest thing is to talk with the moderator, talk with your pastor. But lacking that, you can ask that person if they could find a guest moderator for that meeting so that you can talk, but they are being protected. Someone is running the meeting and making sure nothing out of order is happening. And you can ask for that to happen if that's what you feel is necessary. I saw this because I review all sorts of minutes. They've come in later and we already asked people to partner up. And so Sonia says, can you look it over? And it was because of doing that I saw these minutes. I also want you to note in this that Laura is the clerk. She is also an elder in the class of 2023. This is important because she is a ruling elder sitting on session right now, which means she can fully participate in the meeting even as she's trying desperately to keep track of everything else that's going on. The alternative, and it's true for many people, is you're the clerk, but you're not a sitting elder right now. You might be later, you certainly were once before, but right now you are the clerk. At that point, you're really there to help people remember what decisions have been made, what some of the history behind things are, is this a constitutional action by the Book of Order and by our bylaws, that kind of thing. You really aren't supposed to initiate new ideas. You are the clerk. You're there to record what happens. You're not there to be a participant in debate on an issue, except in those places where you're helping keep things on the straight and narrow. No. I hear what you're saying, but when we did this last time, this is how we did it. Not, you're wrong. We shouldn't do that. That's not your call. Your call is to record things and keep things, as I say, decently and in order, as we Presbyterians say. So if you can remember that in your role, that's a helpful thing for your church. We're all about healthy motions, and you are the one who's there to say, wait a second, this is an incomplete motion. We need to fill this out. The motion is, okay, what's going to be done? Who is going to do it? It's great to say, let's build a space shuttle. All right, well, who here is going to build a space shuttle? If nobody's ready to do that, maybe that's not such a good idea. When will we be done with it? Or when should we expect to have this reported back? Because we might be allotting a sum of money that has to sit there untouched until we know more about what's going on. So we need to know next month. We need to know in 3 months what your estimate has come back to, so we can act on it or free that money up for other ministry. Speaking of money, how much is this going to cost? A lot of times motions will be up to $10,000. So people don't have to come back to you if it's at 7,000. They can just go ahead and do it. But if it's 11,000, they need to come back to you. They don't have permission to spend $11,000. And okay, it's nice to spend money, but where's this money coming from? What account number are we talking about? What committee is responsible for this? And at the end of the day, you're the one who has to go, wait a second, the book of order says this. You know, we need to have a quorum, and we didn't have a quorum tonight. So we can agree that we'll bring this back to our next meeting, but we can't do this right now. Or the church's bylaws say, whatever they say, we need to conform with that. And it's your job to be the one to say, wait a moment. And that's what the church is counting on you to do. Email voting is not something every church does, obviously, but certainly many do. One of the amendments coming up for us to vote on for the next book of order concerns electronic voting or electronic meetings. But, you know, with Zoom and with COVID, many of us have had no choice but to meet electronically. So right now we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants in ways that isn't always healthy. And so one of the things we'll talk about later is email voting, but that's one of the amendments, is to make that more permissible under certain criteria. But remember that email votes, even on little simple things like, you know, whatever you think of as a simple decision, should we have cupcakes at the next worship service, fellowship hour? Email votes aren't official until you approve them at the next meeting. And when I say standard meeting, I mean not an email meeting. At your next, however it is you have official meetings, this email vote has to be retaken. Now, with something like cupcakes, you vote by email, you know, it's coming up. Well, you have the cupcakes, and you then agree at your next meeting that it's good we had cupcakes. When you have a bigger decision and you're just trying to get a sense of things, should we spend $10,000 on the parking lot? If we wait 3 or 4 more days, the cost is just going to go up for some reason or another. Can I get a sense from you as to whether we can do this? People will send their votes in, and you can move ahead, but you really want to vote on that at the next meeting to get it into the official record. Don't make your minutes too complicated. You just need to know what the motion is. You need to know what action the session decides to take. You don't need to put Joe Schmo moved that and Jane Doe seconded. That's something we get used to doing. There can be advantages to it, because then you know who it is felt strongly about that item. And so next year when it comes up, you can go, well, Jane Doe, she seconded it. Maybe we should ask her. But the truth is, once a motion is made and seconded, it becomes the property of the session. It's not that person's anymore. And the truth is, Jane Doe may have seconded it because she just wants to get it on the table so we can talk about it. She may not really care about it. She just wants to be able to talk about it. And you're not supposed to talk about it until you have a second, because if you just make a motion and start talking about it, you may just be talking and nobody really cares what you're talking about, because nobody seconded it to say it's important enough to talk about. So you can't assume that. So what's your motion? What's the action? And if you give up some of the context, it can be helpful, but you don't want to get bogged down in it. You're just making your life harder when you're trying to explain, because then people are going to read the minutes and go, well, you said Jane Doe agreed and seconded. Well, Jane says she didn't really agree. She just wanted to talk about it. Well, now you've given too much information, and that's just there for people to pick apart if they want to. So just the motion and the action, making sure that a second has happened, but it doesn't really matter who's first made the motion or seconded it. Again, you can write up a draft of the meeting before the meeting happens, because there's some things you know are going to pass. You know what's coming because hopefully you've worked with your moderator to figure out the agenda. And then when it doesn't go the way you planned, which is the work of the Holy Spirit sometimes and just the way humanity works other times, you just change the draft, but you've pretty much done all of your work ahead of time. And I also know people who, when they're changing their roles and registers, adding people, or if someone's died or transferred, they wait till December and say, well, nothing else is going to happen probably. I'll just do it all then. You're setting yourself up for a lot of work because you've got to go through your minutes. You've got to find all that information. Then you've got to find out, oh, I needed to know their maiden name and I don't have that. Now I've got to figure it out at a time of year when it can be hard to get hold of people. Just do it every month. Do it every quarter. I can only hope that you have so many entries to make with adding members each quarter that becomes a full day's job. But chances are for many of us quarterly, you might only have a few notations to make of, a baptism or a wedding or a death or a transfer. There aren't that many, generally speaking. So if you keep up with it, your life is a lot simpler. There are things you can plan ahead on. And this is, I see. I'm assuming, I'm not sure if you can see this or not. Can you see this piece of paper I'm holding up? This is the calendar that Sonia and I work on together. And we update it and we change it. But this tells me that in March, annual reports are due. So I know in March I need to do that. Well, you can do the same thing. Just planning ahead as to what you know is coming. So you can see that on these minutes, they already know, and I'll get to this in a moment, but having the roster of who is on session and what year it is. And even if you just do that in January, you'll know that year. And in fact, if you do it every January, now in this church, they do it at every meeting, which is even better. But even if in every January you put the class of 21, 22, 23, you put the clerk's election date and a term, the treasurer's term, then every year, in January, I can't remember, when was I elected? Excuse me. You'll know right where to turn. Makes your life so much easier. And I've spent so much time in session meetings, even where I've been the moderator and we just lost track, where people are, you know what? I don't think I should be here. I think my term expired. And you don't want to figure that out in the middle of a meeting. You want to know ahead of time when someone's term expires. So you can see that they've identified that there. And you're the one who can make sure some things get put into the minutes. You're the clerk. You have a report to make. So in the January meeting, you put down that the clerk reported to the session, and you tell the session, just so you remember, we had a sexual misconduct policy revised last March or 2 Marches ago, child and youth protection policy. This is when it was revised. Our manual of operations, you can see we're revising it now, but as of 2018, it's effective. And you can find all of this in the manual of operations, and here are places you can find it. And yes, Jamie.
Are we supposed to record this then in our minutes every year that we have these 3 documents?
Yes,
I wanted to verify that that's what you were saying.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. In part, it's because the Presbytery is going to ask, so now you know quickly where to look and find it. But also if something, and hopefully nothing ever does, but if your insurance company needs to talk to you about this, You want to show them that everybody knew we had these things and something bad happened and they were informed, or at least they could have been informed. You do not see the calendar. Okay, I'll see what I can see. Oh, I wasn't sure if it could work or not. Sorry about that. I was just holding up a piece of paper to show you we have to play by the same rules you do. So I have a calendar of events that we look to do.
I was
Can
just
I
typing
interrupt
that
for
to
a minute?
everybody, Steve. Your background is blurry, so anything you hold up will be blurry.
Oh, thank you. Have I used Zoom before?
Can I interrupt for a minute?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to get on the Zoom on my computer. This is Connie Chulminsky. I'm from the Franklin Church, so I'm just on a phone call.
Okay.
When back to the e-voting, when you had said, you know, we wouldn't actually, you'd figure out how people felt, how the session felt on this particular e-vote, but at the next meeting is when we should vote and have the motion. What we're doing now when we do an e-vote, as long as there isn't any discussion and everyone is in favor of this vote, we vote then. And then on that month's like previous minutes, I add it to the bottom after we close the minutes, and I put that, you know, we had an e-vote on such and such a date and it was closed on, you know, a day or two later at whatever time, and what the vote was. Is that acceptable, or should I be doing it this other way now?
You should be doing it the other way.
Okay, I
Because
just wanted to clarify that.
you're doing the right part in terms of it's communicated that it happened. But according to Roberts, it hasn't actually happened.
Okay, okay, great. All righty, thank you.
Sure.
Can I ask a question about that too?
Please.
Because
Yes.
we've been doing the same thing. I've been writing it as an addendum to the minutes since it happened in that month. But sometimes we're doing it because time is of the essence, so the action has already taken place by the time we get to the next meeting. So are we saying we're approving it retroactively?
Essentially, yes, you are. Even though technically it's not retroactive at all, it's now happening.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's just to make the vote official. As someone has, we can include a consent agenda listing all of the e-votes and then approve that. Yeah, that would work. Yeah.
Question for you about the evo. It's
Yeah.
Christine Schmidt with Titusville. I mean, with COVID and the problems we've had meeting over the past couple of years, a lot of things that occurred from 2020 and 2021 are considered an e-vote. So are you telling me that because we didn't actually vote on them at an in-person meeting, that these are not approved?
Well, an e-vote is different than an email vote. So when you have, what constitutes a meeting is everyone has to be able to speak. The word is contemporaneously. You need to be able to talk to each other. That's what is a meeting. So an email vote is not that, because you answer and then I see your answer and I don't want to upset you and I know you're going to see my answer, so I go ahead and just vote the way you vote. I'm influenced. Whereas an electronic meeting by Zoom, you're all there. And so you can talk to each other and argue with each other and then vote all at the same time.
Well, not so much a Zoom meeting, but I mean like an email. It's an email vote where there's a couple things that have come up that we needed to have a decision made quickly,
Then
like within a week.
Yes, if it is an email vote, you
Yeah.
need to vote on it at your next meeting, even though you already did. And so the idea of, if you do a lot of that, the idea of a consent agenda that includes those is a good idea.
All right,
but-
I mean, it's listed in the minutes that under my clerk of session report that we, through an email decision, this decision was made by an email vote.
According to Roberts, it isn't a real vote until you make it at a contemporaneous meeting. So yes,
Okay.
some things you can act on
Mhm.
because you don't have much of a choice. But the example I used before, do we spend $10,000 on the parking lot? That should wait till the next meeting. really email votes are supposed to be for kind of basic things. If it's an important thing and it's urgent, you need to call a meeting so you can do that. To spend
I have
$10,000
one.
based on an email vote would be,
No, these are
Dicey.
the things that they're time sensitive, such as, what was it? Changing of the meeting location or canceling meetings from being in person to, for this week, we had a couple outbreaks of COVID. So we've decided last minute, we're going to have a Zoom only meeting. That was one of the votes that we took last year. We had a member of the congregation that tested positive for COVID. So as a precaution, we through an email vote agreed that we were going to do Zoom only meetings. And that was taken through an email vote decision.
well, then I would say if it's that common for that kind of basic stuff, the idea of a consent agenda that includes all of those votes would be acceptable, but somehow you actually have to vote on it when you have your next meeting.
Okay. Well, at least I know for what to do for going forward. So, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the big things
That was-
is, sorry.
That was my question. This is Connie Chominski again from Franklin. Because we have done this and we're at the end of 2022 and we've done this all year, and almost every month we do have an e-vote, which is done through email, not on Zoom. Would I say at next month's meeting, doing a consent agenda to approve the whole, up to that point, 2022's, all of our e-votes and put that in the minutes?
I would not do that for the whole year, but now.
Okay.
And so for the rest of the
Okay.
year, do it. We don't ask in the minute review form, did you go back and vote in person on things that you voted on by email? We don't ask that. What we
Okay.
do ask
Okay.
is, and expect, is in your manual of operations, you come up with an email or electronic voting policy that everybody
Mhm.
can read and agrees to, so that everybody understands how this works. And we ask
Okay.
that you have that.
So in our manual of operations, we do have an e-vote policy, but it doesn't include, bringing it to the next meeting for a formal vote. So then should we amend our manual of operations to include that?
Yes,
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
sure. And a lot of that information you can already find in the clerk's manual that's online on the Presbytery website. There is the Presbytery's policy and then some additional notes for you to consider as you are putting that policy together. Because this is new for all of
Okay.
us. I mean, we just had
Right.
our first hybrid meeting as a presbytery earlier this month, or actually last month. And trying to figure out how do we count the votes and everything else is a challenge. So we're not
Mhm,
immune to this.
mhm. Okay.
Please
Alrighty.
explain a consent agenda is when you have some basic items that you don't believe are controversial, and you just make a list of those items on your agenda headed by consent agenda. And then you as the clerk would be asked by the moderator to offer the consent agenda. And so you'd say, I place the
Mhm.
consent agenda before the session. If there's anything anyone would like to take off the consent agenda, please do so now, and we will place it under new business at the end of the meeting. Much of the
Mhm.
time, everybody
Okay.
just goes, okay, and they wave their hand and it's fine. And they vote on it and it's all done. You don't have to vote on each one. But if someone
Mhm.
says, I'm not so sure about that third item, I'd like to talk about that, then if it's just a simple question, you can answer a simple question. But if it's something that they really want to talk about it, then you move it to under new business and you dive in at the end.
Mhm. Okay. All righty, thank you.
Sure thing.
Steve, I'm not sure that I have a manual of operation. Where would I find that?
Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that in our third hour, and where
Okay.
you can get more information on that. So let's hang tight on that. We have just a couple of minutes till it's Trisha's time to be with us. So again, you can plan ahead. And what I was trying to show you that was blurrier than I realized is a calendar. And so Sonia and I and Jean and Liz and I have our calendars that we work with. And so in January, I can plan ahead in certain ways, as can you. You can put in the January minutes, here's the year's budget. Here's the pastor's compensation. Now, maybe that happens in February, depending on when your annual meeting is compared to your session meeting. You might put a note in that the previous year's audit was completed, just so that you can say you did it. In March, by then, hopefully you have your annual statistical report from the General Assembly. Put a copy of that in your minutes, your session minutes. Yes, you can put it in a file cabinet, but someday no one's going to know what's in that file cabinet. They aren't even going to know what paper is at some point, it might be. And they're not going to know what this stuff is. And so if you have it in your session minutes and they want to see what the General Assembly statistical report looked like in 1903, they'll go to the session minutes at the Historical Society. Putting it in a file is good for our convenience, but for the sake of finding it in the future easily, putting it in the session minutes is required. I'm sorry, that should not say annual statistical report. That should say your session minute review. You want to put in there because you'll have it done by then.
I have one more question.
Sure.
When you said we put the budget in, well, you know, when that gets approved, what was the first thing you said should also be in there? Was the pastor's terms of call worksheet, or what did you
Yes.
say?
Well, having the
Yep.
pastor's terms of call, yep. You want to make sure those
Okay.
things are recorded and available.
Okay.
And if you do it
So
all at
that
the
should
same
go in the
time,
minutes after that particular month when it gets
Exactly.
approved?
exactly.
Right.
And
And
while
then the budget, the
Mhm.
statistical report, was there anything else?
putting in that your minutes were reviewed in October, because by then it will have
Okay.
happened.
Okay. All righty, thank you.
Sure. Speaking of the terms of call, and this will be where we stop, I think. There is a terms of call worksheet. It's available online. You can see how you can get it under the Committee on Ministry page on the website. And of course, you can always call Sonia. We need you to fill this out. It is the only way that the Committee on Ministry, your pastor, and your session and your congregation are all on the same page as to what the compensation is for your pastor. And if something should come up, and things do come up, this is something all of those parties can look to see what was agreed to. And so these are required by the Committee on Ministry. And you can certainly put it in your minutes once it's done so that you have a record of it. Same with your annual report from your congregational meeting. It's not required to be in your minutes. It doesn't hurt to have it in your session book, minutes book, because then you can always find it. And that's your job as the clerk, is to be able to do what King Ahasuerus's clerks did. Something happened, I can put my hand on it, here you go. So with that, I would like to stop sharing the screen. And we have among us right now, there she is, Tricia Dykers-Koenig, and she is an associate stated clerk. And as I mentioned earlier, if you watched any of the General Assembly, you would have seen her directing traffic and It is a real pleasure and honor to have her here. She's been a mentor and a friend and a colleague, and I'm very grateful that you can be with us today, Tricia.
Well, happy to be here. Thank you all. Looking forward to this hour. Clerks of session, and I understand that we have some session moderators as well. I thank you for your service to Christ through the PCUSA. We are here to focus on parliamentary procedure during this hour, but let's begin by thinking about what it means to be a Presbyterian flavor of Christian. So I want to start with some PCUSA trivia, and I think Steve has a poll to put up in Zoom. So this is about the Book of Order, which is part 2 of the PCUSA Constitution, part 1 being the Book of Confessions. So just kind of play along here. What are the sections of the Book of Order? And this is for you to work on there.
You're making me look good, Tricia. You're asking much harder questions.
I don't know if that's good or not good. So yeah, let's see. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. You don't see the whole thing, but the first, all of the answers, maybe you do. Book of Confessions and Rules for Governance being the first choice. Foundations of Presbyterian Polity, Form of Government, Directory for Worship, Rules of Discipline being the second in line there. Historic Principles, Church of Order, Theology of Christian Worship being the third choice, and all of the above being the fourth choice. So you all, half of you have chosen the second one, Foundations of Presbyterian Polity, Form of Government, Directory for Worship, and Rules of Discipline, and that is correct. You can end the poll, Steve. Little more than half. Abbreviations that precede section numbers are F, G, W, and D for those. So Foundations is F, Form of Government G, Directory for Worship W, and Rules of Discipline D. And those, when we cite things in the Book of Order, that's pretty much, it'll be D or F or D. So there we go. Very good. Well done. And I think maybe, Steve, I have capacity to share my screen. So I'm going to do that for a little bit. See if we can do that. This always happens to me. At the thing at the top means I can't turn it to slideshow. Do that deal.
You want to start from the beginning. There you go.
All right, we'll do that for now and we'll see how it goes. Okay. And then we're going to move down. So you're an ordained Presbyterian if you're a clerk of session, and all of us have answered this question: who is your Lord and Savior? And I know you know the answer. Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. We look to Jesus Christ as head of the church, and at our best, we seek to follow where Christ leads, but we're not so arrogant that we think we automatically know Christ's will. We believe very strongly that our best chance of figuring it out is to do it together while open to the Holy Spirit. We Presbyterians have a healthy appreciation for the reality of human sin, and that leads us to be very leery of giving too much power to any one person. So we lodge authority not in individuals, but in groups. That means that meetings are how we do Presbyterian. It's a foundation of Presbyterian polity that we always allow the opportunity to talk and pray together before we make decisions, and the majority rules. The form of government requires meetings of councils to be conducted using the most recent edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, which is now the 12th edition. And so, Steve, poll number 2, and we'll stop sharing there. And the question in poll number 2 is going to be, what is a council according to the Book of Order? I'll give you let's see. I don't know, Steve, are you putting those up?
I'm sorry, I ducked out for a second.
Okay, poll number 2, which is what is a council according to the Book of Order? And the answers are, your choices are congregation, session, and board of deacons, the leadership team of a presbytery or synod, general assembly, synod, presbytery, and session, or all of the above. Those are your choices this time. So what do you think? Answers coming in. Got a few more yet to discern. Okay, looks like everybody's played that wishes to play, so we'll end the poll and share the results. And 53% of you, whoops, share the results, chose General Assembly, Synod, Presbytery, and Session. According to the Book of Order, those are Presbyterian councils. So technically, the Board of Deacons and congregations are not councils, which are Session, Presbytery, Synod, and General Assembly. So deacons and congregations are not required to use Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, but practically most, if not all, PCUSA meetings are going to use RNOR, and that is the accepted shorthand, which seems odd to me, but that's what the people who do this say is the accepted abbreviation, or just Robert. And because congregations and others are used to using it in other places, they're probably going to use it in, the deacons are probably going to use it as well. So Robert's Rules of Order is based on the same principles enshrined in the foundations of Presbyterian polity, and that includes opportunity for discussion. Listening to one another as part of the discernment process is required before the vote. So let's go here. RONR intends to protect the rights of all parties, while the majority rules the rights of the minority to be heard are safeguarded. As members together of the body of Christ, we value everyone's contribution, recognizing that the Spirit may be speaking through a solitary voice leading the way. Sometimes we will not agree, and often conflicting convictions are going to be strong, but we will allow one another the chance to be heard. If any person or group is silenced or railroaded, then we're doing it wrong. Of course, that does not mean that each individual in a large group will always get the chance to speak, but each should have heard their views reflected in the discussion. When everyone's goal is to seek the will of Christ, it's important to honor the image of God in each other, even when we may find that image hard to recognize, or maybe especially then. When the process is fair and perceived as such, it's a bit easier to go forward with the majority despite being in the minority in a particular instance. For Christians, at our best, it's not my way or the highway, but it is the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. The process detailed in RONR is not an end in itself, but it is an instrumental means to an end. The rules are here to help everyone's voice be heard so that the body might discern the will of Christ. It's our collective job to cooperate with one another so that the rules facilitate efficient, but more important, equitable and satisfying participation. If the rules get in the way, we violated their spirit and intent, no matter how technically correct we may be. And I want to emphasize that quite a bit. If the rules get in the way, then we violated them. While every participant has a part to play in making meetings go smoothly and reaching faithful decisions, the person most responsible for that is the presiding officer or chair, termed the moderator in Presby speak. And for some reason, these slides are not progressing, so I don't know what that's about. There we go. Sorry about that. So does RNOR with its stuffy rules and procedures sometimes get in the way of good decisions? Yes, sometimes it does. Those who know the rules and are comfortable with them always have an advantage if the decision-making process is looked upon as a contest. If what we are doing, however, is seeking the will of Christ, then it's not a battle of wills. It's a matter of discernment, and we're all in it together toward one goal, which is thy will be done. This is one example of how Robert's Rules of Order and our Book of Order are in perfect agreement in terms of what our principles are. And the moderator is the one who's in charge. It's up to the whole group, however, with the moderator's leadership, to make the rules a tool and not a weapon. Following rules of decorum is doing your part to keep the proceedings decent and in order. If you're ever in a meeting and you're feeling like you're getting lost, you should speak up to slow it down. The rules give you that right. If you're feeling overwhelmed, chances are that you're not alone. You can also speak up if you believe that the process has gotten off track. So Steve, let's go to poll number 3. And we'll stop sharing. And poll number 3 is this: when a point of order about parliamentary procedure is raised, a ruling is made by whom? The stated clerk or clerk of session, the moderator, the parliamentarian, or any of the above. The answer is coming. A few more seconds for people to choose. Okay, and there you go. 33%, or most of you, more than others, have chosen the moderator, and that is correct. The clerk of session is responsible for keeping the records of the session in the congregation, including minutes of meetings, and for correspondence, and might make a report or work with the moderator on developing an agenda, but the clerk has no formal role in running a meeting. When the moderator rules on the point of order, that ruling can be appealed. With luck, you won't be in too many situations with that level of conflict, though. All right, I'm gonna try going back to sharing the screen. See if that works. Ah, very good. So briefly, assuming I can mix it, there we go. A review of the formal process for making a decision. Only one main motion, which is a motion which brings business before the body, can be on the floor at a time. Here's how it gets there and what happens next. The motion is moved. It may be made by an individual, such as an officer as part of a report, or any member who is recognized by the moderator, or a motion can come from a committee as a recommendation. If an individual makes the motion, it will sometimes require a second, which is simply an affirmation that more than one member thinks this is worth discussing. When the motion comes from a committee, then it's obvious already that more than one person wants to consider it and no second is needed. The moderator states the question. That means repeats the motion. When the moderator states the question, it is said to be on the floor or pending. A long motion probably won't be read in its entirety if it's available in print or on screen, but the moderator must ensure that everyone knows exactly what it is. That's really important. Then the moderator calls for debate. The maker of the motion has the right to speak first if desired. Sometimes questions are invited of the committee making the recommendation, for example, before proceeding to debate. During debate, usually members are recognized by alternating pro and con. If one side outnumbers the other, its speakers still have the right to speak unless debate has been limited. But if it's dragging out, then the moderator might suggest that the body move on and do so unless there's an objection. During the course of debate, subsidiary motions may be made. That's usually amendments. For each of these, you repeat the process. No member may speak more than once on a motion until everyone who wishes has had the opportunity, and then only twice. And this is in formal process. After each amendment and when debate has concluded, and at any time where there might be confusion, the moderator states the motion again, as it is at that point with any amendments that have been adopted. When no one else wishes to speak, the motion is put to a vote. Another way to say this, if you're the moderator, is, are you ready for the question? And then the motion is, and the moderator says what that is again. If there's any possibility of confusion, the moderator must make sure that everyone knows the effect of a yes or a no. The default method for taking a vote at an in-person meeting is by voice. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say no. Other options when you don't need to count are a rising vote or a show of hands. When a meeting is happening online, depending on the size of the group, you might be using yes or no buttons, or taking a Zoom poll like we've been doing here, only you actually are counting, or raising an electronic hand, or even raising your flesh and blood hand to the camera. We don't have time today to go into the details about electronic meeting technology, but the principles for inclusivity and fairness are the same as they are in person. Most motions are adopted by a majority of those voting. When the requirement is for a 2/3 vote, it is generally a motion to restrict the rights of a member of the body, such as cutting off debate, or to change a previous action, such as suspending the rules. And then the moderator declares the results. For a voice vote, it would be the ayes have it and the motion is adopted, or the noes have it and the motion is lost. If not by voice, the chair would say the affirmative has it or the negative. When the vote is counted, the tally should be announced. And then the moderator explains briefly what will happen as a result of the vote.
Tricia, I have a quick question. You had mentioned about subsidiary motions, in other words, amendments. Do they get voted on first before the primary motion, or does the primary motion supersede that? How does that work in order?
Yes, if there is an amendment, then that comes as you're debating the main motion, then the amendment would be voted on first before you would decide the entire thing. So you'd know what you'd be deciding. So,
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you for affirming that.
absolutely. So it
And
sounds to me.
I also,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I have a question too before we go further.
Okay.
I'm from the old school and I've been the clerk for many years. And years ago, the moderator did not vote, just the session voted. But now I've been told the moderator can vote. In the past, the moderator broke a tie if there was a tie. So now the moderators can vote?
Well, we're going to get to some of that in a little bit.
Okay,
But
okay,
the
that's fine. I just
moderator,
didn't
as
want to
the
go
pastor,
further.
the pastor is a member of the session and so does have the right to vote. And depending on how the
Okay.
voting is, if it's a ballot, then the moderator can vote anytime.
Okay, thank you.
Informal
Okay.
process, the moderator probably wouldn't vote unless to break a tie. But,
Okay. All righty, thank you.
sure. So it's not always necessary, even in a large gathering such as a Presbytery meeting, to go through that whole process. If the moderator is pretty sure the motion isn't controversial and everyone knows what it is and is absolutely positive of what they're voting on, then the moderator can just say, is there any objection? Pause and scan the room. After everyone has been given fair opportunity to object, then the moderator would say, hearing no objection, so ordered. And then the motion is passed. If there is an objection, of course, then you would take a vote. And it looks to me like that's because I was in on listening to the last part of your conversation in the previous hour that you've already talked about a consent agenda. So I just want to skip whatever I was going to say about that. And let's go, Steve, to the next pop quiz.
Before we move to the next quiz, may I ask a confirmation on that or correction? Because the question came up with electronic voting. I had said that you still have to vote on an email vote when you're at the next stated meeting. You need to kind of confirm that email vote. And someone suggested that they take a number of the email votes and they make a consent agenda with those and just vote on, we by email, we voted on this, by email, we voted on this, and vote on that in one fell swoop. It seemed reasonable to me, but I would certainly defer to your opinion.
Yeah, I think if everybody has agreed and before, you could probably just say consent agenda is to ratify all the votes that were taken by email. And I don't think you would even have to vote on them separately. If your rules are saying you need to vote on those after you've taken an email vote. I have a couple of thoughts about email votes. I think we'll talk about that in a little bit, or I could say it now, I suppose. And that is, our principles really require a discussion. So you should only be taking email votes if it's just a no-brainer. If it is something that's going to be controversial, then you should not be taking that by email, because people haven't had a chance to discuss it and you've heard somebody else's thoughts. So it really is something that, in my view, you shouldn't do if there's going to be any objection to it, because you haven't followed the principle that we don't vote until after we've listened to each other decide, and help in our discernment. You haven't had a chance to do that if it's by email, unless you've already had your conversation, and even then, it's probably not a good idea. So,
Bill Lowe is asking, for a vote that is not by voice, as clerk, do we document who votes for and against the motion?
no, you don't need to say anything about who voted for and against. That's not something you'd record.
You would like poll 4?
I would. And that is, what is a quorum? At least the majority of the membership, the number of members who must be present in order to conduct business, determined by the clerk, or all of the above. What is a quorum? Okay, this one is not a question for you all for the most part, and you are correct. Almost everybody said the number of members that must be present in order to conduct business. That's the definition of a quorum. So let us share again. And again, it's not wanting me to be able to advance the slide. Here we go. Okay. This slide talks about the book of has RO and R and what is quorum, and then also rules about what quorums are for congregations and councils. Before the meeting is called to order, it is the duty of the moderator actually to determine that a quorum is present according to RO and R. It doesn't require anyone to announce that you have one, though you might have a custom of doing that. Your congregation, session, presbytery, and synod should have stated the quorum in your own rules, but if you haven't, then the default number in RO and R is a majority of the entire membership. And you can see why you wouldn't want to make your quorum in a congregation the majority of the entire membership. You'd want to have a rule that says something else, because the majority of the entire membership may be way more than anybody who would ever show up. What if you don't have a quorum or you lose the quorum? You can't do business other than to take steps to obtain one, which is to try rounding people up or meet at another time.
Do you have a recommendation of 20% of the congregation, or a number that seems to work generally?
You know, I don't really know, Steve. I haven't ever really thought about that. I think sometimes it's even 10%.
Yeah, but it is. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Not one I've thought about. So I wouldn't want to opine really, but you want to make it a significant enough group, of course, that people can, that people who weren't there will feel like that was a legitimate decision, but not so many people that you can never get that many folks there to vote. And so you can't ever conduct business, and that would be a little bit dangerous. Okay, so this is a bit about different kinds of motions that you're likely to encounter. This chart is the 13 ranking motions, which shows the hierarchy of them, motions that are in order when other motions are pending or on the floor. And I think Steve is going to put a link in the chat to a booklet that includes this chart. The main motion is
it's actually on our website now. We've taken it and made it available to folks on our website.
Oh, awesome. Perfect. That's great. So you're going to see that the main motion is the bottom, and it's the lowest ranking. It's a motion that brings business before the body, and it's not in order while any other motion is on the floor. Lower ranking motions are not in order. Well, I think I said that already. Yep. So, for example, if a motion to limit debate is on the floor, which is number 6 in this hierarchy, then it is in order to move to take a recess, which is number 11, but it wouldn't be, but vice versa wouldn't be true. If a motion to postpone to a definite time is on the floor, It's not in order to move to amend the main motion, but it would be in order to move to amend the motion to postpone, because that's amendable motion, for example, to a different time. When several motions are pending, the last one made must be disposed of first until the body works its way back in reverse order to the main motion. And so that goes to the question about if there's a motion to amend, do you vote on the main motion first or the amendment? You vote on the amendment and then you get back to the main motion. So subsidiary motions, which are 2 through 8 in this chart, do something to or with the main motion. And privileged motions relate to the rights of members or of the body. Chart number 2 is some incidental motions, which are procedural questions that are not hierarchical to each other, so they can come at pretty much at any time. And motions that bring a question again before an assembly, these ones down there. So reconsider or rescind or take from the table. You might wish to keep the charts of motions and their characteristics handy when you're in a large meeting. We don't have time to go over this in detail, but a lot of these you're not going to see in your session meeting. You might in the Presbytery meeting. These are characteristics of main motions, though there are exceptions. Usually a second is required, but there are some actions that one person can do alone. A member needs information or believes that something may be unclear or amiss. Usually a member can't interrupt another member without being out of order, but some motions are urgent enough that this is permitted. Lots of motions can be debated, but some cannot. For example, it doesn't do to spend a lot of time debating process matters, so that attempts to save time end up taking more time. You talk about limiting debate, and then you spend a lot of time cutting down the time that people can speak, and you just wasted a bunch of time doing that. Amendments are probably what you're going to deal with most, but there are some motions that don't have variables. You either do them or you don't. So, Steve, poll number 5. And this is, how do you define a majority? Oops. I'm sorry, I may have given you the wrong number. Anyway, we'll do that one later.
You want to stop this?
Yeah, stop that one.
I'm also noticing.
Sorry about that. That's okay. You'll have
Sonia, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. What do you need?
I'm not seeing poll number 6. I don't know if there's a way you can fix that or not.
Well, anyway, we'll talk about a majority. A majority is more than half. And so sometimes people will say a majority is 50% plus 1 or 51%, but that's not actually the case. Just more than half, and sometimes that is, it's not going to be the same as 50% plus 1 or 51%. Let's see. Okay, well, I seem to have lost where I am. Anyway, if there are 125 people, for example, 51% would be 63.75 and 50.1 is 63.5, but more than half is simply 63. So you're going to remember that. Most do require a majority.
Tricia, before you get a little farther, we first had a recommendation of 10% as a helpful number for a quorum for a congregation. And secondly, someone pointed out that the hierarchy of questions was not, it went a little fast. And they wondered if you could recap that.
The hierarchy of
hierarchy.
motion?
Motions, I guess is what they mean. They wrote questions, yes.
Yeah, okay. So let's see, I think we're gonna get to some of these in a minute. Maybe not. So basically this means when there's a main motion on the floor, like in number 1 there, any of these other motions are in order if the main motion is the thing that's on the floor and that's the first thing. So you could decide that you wanted to not talk about that now, and you could move to postpone. Well, postpone indefinitely is one you probably won't use very much. If that motion number 2 means you don't want to talk about it ever, probably. And so that's a way to kill something in that particular meeting, at least. Mostly you're going to get to amend, and people say, we'll talk a little bit more about amending as when we get to what I was going to say next. Some of these other things, like perhaps someone says that there's a motion to amend on the floor, but something comes up and you need to go away from that to something else. That would be a motion to postpone definitely. So let's say let's postpone this until after we can hear from the treasurer about that. The treasurer's not here yet. And so you might postpone that, you might vote to postpone definitely, and that motion is kind of set aside, you go on to something else, then you come back, you hear from the treasurer, and then you can vote on it again. So it's just what's in order when things are on the floor. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but maybe when we get a little bit further into what I'm going to talk about, might get answered, and then if it isn't after that, ask again. I want to spend some time with amendments because that's probably what you're going to see the most. Only one primary amendment can be on the floor at a time. So if somebody wants to amend a different part of the main motion, then they have to wait until that first thing is disposed of. A motion to amend must be germane. That means it can't introduce a new subject, and it may take 3 forms. That's to insert or add, to strike out, or to do both, often called strike and insert. And in a primary simple amendment, the words have to be consecutive. If a main motion is that the sanctuary doors be painted red no later than September 1, a primary amendment might be, I move to strike painted red and insert replaced with glass doors at a cost not to exceed $1,000, so that the motion reads that the sanctuary doors be replaced with glass doors at a cost not to exceed $1,000 no later than September 1. Debate then would be limited to the amendment itself and can't extend to the main motion. So you're focusing on red paint versus glass at that point, not on whether to do anything to the doors or the deadline. Then you get to a secondary amendment, and that's an amendment to the amendment, where you can start getting kind of confused. So you might say, if you don't want to spend that $1,000 on the door, you might say, I move to strike $1,000 and insert $500. But that's as far as you can go down this track. There's no amendment to the amendment to the amendment. There's just 2 chances. Though once, if you have, strike 1,000 and insert 500, once that's passed or defeated, that you could have another secondary amendment and say, iron doors or something like that. Once amendments are approved or not, then you're back to the main motion. And it's when you're back to the main motion that would be the time to argue about whether the doors are fine the way they are. You don't want to paint them or replace them. A substitute is a motion to amend by replacing a whole paragraph with different wording or amendment that has words that are not consecutive. When a substitute is moved, both it and the main motion go through the amendment process before deciding whether to replace the main motion with the substitute. This happens sometimes, fairly often in General Assembly, for example, but not that often, probably in a complicated form in your session. So I do want to move on from amendments to other ranking motions. Commit or refer, like perhaps the recommendation that's come to you is not ready for prime time and it needs more work. This motion seeks to send it to another group, usually a smaller one, committee, for further consideration. And sometimes it will have special instructions to that group. Motions to commit or refer should be specific about the details so that the group that's getting it is making decisions, but knows what the parameters are for those decisions. It is common for people to move to table a motion when they really intend the effect of the motion to postpone to a particular time. The motion to table is undebatable, and it is properly used only when something of immediate urgency has arisen, like the food is here or the fire alarm's going off, and the motion doesn't specify a time when the matter will be taken up again. There is another motion to postpone definitely, which I mentioned a little bit ago, which is usually more appropriate. For example, to postpone until something else has happened in the session or more information can be gathered, or to a specific hour. Like we want more people to be voting on this, so we want to postpone this till after lunch, for example. A body by a 2/3 vote can modify debate by setting more or less strict time limits on individual speeches, the number of speeches, the total time for further debate, or the hour by which a vote will be taken. Such a motion should be clear about whether it's intended to apply to the immediately pending matter, which could be like just that amendment. Let's limit the debate on that, or all pending matters, just that amendment and the main motion, or all the business you have left. We're just getting, we're running out of time. We only want to talk for a minute and a half instead of our usual 2 minutes about this. So there's that. And then this is a popular motion, move the previous question, or to call the question, which means close debate immediately and proceed to a vote. And so that's where, let's bring up that poll that was we saw before.
Is it appearing?
I don't see it. There we go. Member wishing to move immediately to a vote should call out question, should explain why the debate has gone on too long, should, after being recognized by the moderator, say, I move the previous question, or should wave their arms and stomp their feet. What do you think?
We don't see that slide.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing the poll.
Oh, you're not? Well, okay, never mind. We'll just skip that. The motion to move the previous question, that is kind of a favorite one. And I've seen a lot of people think that they can just kind of yell out in the middle of the meeting question, and that means everybody has to pay attention to them. But this is not true. The previous question has to be recognized by the moderator. So you have to raise your hand and be recognized. You have to say, I move the previous question, or I call the question after you have been recognized. And you do have to take a vote on it. I was in a meeting in a congregation in my first call where somebody insisted that if somebody just yelled out question, that meant you had to stop debate at that very minute. And that's not true. It is something that gets voted on, and it requires a 2/3 vote to pass. That's because it is cutting off the rights of people who still want to speak. And that is eliminating rights of some of the members, and then that does take a 2/3 vote. If it does pass, then the body moves on to immediate vote on the question that was called. So, all right. Seeing there we go. Okay. The next one, lay on the table, I mentioned a minute ago, it's a different motion than to postpone to a definite or certain time. And it's properly used only when something urgent comes up while a motion is pending, such as the arrival of a speaker who can only be present for a limited time. It's going to require a later motion to bring the matter back from the table, but there's no specified time for that to happen. So somebody needs to remember you didn't do that, make a motion and bring it back. If the body's desires a specified hour, then that's postponed definitely or certainly. If someone moves to table when they likely mean postpone, which is usually when they do move to table, then the savvy moderator is going to gently assume the correct motion and proceed accordingly. Okay, that's it for the subsidiary ranking motions, and I am going to skip the next ones, the next few slides, because I don't think we have time for those. But and you're usually not going to see these anyway in your session meeting. Okay. Now, do your session board of deacons and committees follow all those rules? If you're like mine or any committee meeting that I've ever been in, the answer would be no, we don't do it all. We're not that stuffy about all that. In my experience, session committees and presbytery committees are in the habit of discussing issues without a motion on the floor until consensus has been reached and agreeing on the final wording together before somebody makes a motion and you vote. And maybe you thought that you've been doing it not according to Robert's Rules of Order, but good news, that is okay, assuming no free-for-all. Our O&R says in a board meeting where there are not more than about a dozen members present, some of the formality that is necessary in a large assembly would hinder business. Among the more flexible rules, note these that are on the screen. You don't have to second a motion. You can talk informally while a motion is pending, even if there's a motion on the floor. You can even take a vote when the motion hasn't been introduced if everybody's pretty clear about what it is, and it really is, it's okay to let the clerk say, you know, I've got this, I pretty much know what it is. And a chair who is a member can speak and vote on all questions. So again, that also goes to whether or not the moderator can vote. So the answer is yes, and that is okay. This is also, so small boards would be a lot of sessions. Some would be too large to have that work well, but a lot of sessions are going to be around the size where you can do this. And in committees, which generally do not make final decisions, but only make recommendations to the parent body, motions to limit or close debate are not even allowed. Robert says that that's in order that there may be no interference with the assemblies having the benefit of its committee's mature judgment. Installed pastors and associate pastors are members of session and have the right to vote as mentioned before. The informality does sometimes make it harder to move along in discussion when people begin to repeat points or one person is dominating. A skilled moderator will look for opportunities to ask people whether someone else who hasn't spoken have anything to add. The expectation in Robert is that no member speaks more than once until everyone who wishes has had the opportunity. The chair might want to establish that people will wait to speak until called on, and that can help. Robert details several ways of allowing even a larger body to wrestle with an issue in a period of freer discussion in order to consider a number of ideas before formal debate and voting, or even after formal debate has begun, if it seems wise. And these are different versions of the motion to commit that signal relaxation of more formal debate. Usually in your session, you're not going to need to do this, but you might, or you might see it happen in a Presbytery meeting. Robert doesn't mention prayer time, but prayer, along with other ways to get people listening to one another in the spirit, is acceptable and encouraged. So does the body have to decide when there's significant disagreement? It may be that more prayer and listening might lead to options that have not yet been considered. Remember, the goal of Presbyterians is to discern the will of Christ, and it's not to win your way. So seeking consensus is often valuable. Some decisions can be put off, but others have practical deadlines. You can find books and articles that outline processes and practices for reaching consensus. Your group would need to decide if they are appropriate for your situation. But you want to think about this. Do you want to take an action that only a slight majority favors, or that even a small minority vehemently opposes? On the other hand, when a minority is stubborn, insisting on consensus privileges the status quo and prevents the majority from moving forward. So let's look at a few miscellaneous concepts you'll need to know. And I think maybe, Steve, the polls aren't there, but we may not have time for them anyway.
It looks like we're missing 6, but if there are others you want, just let me know.
Well, that's okay. We probably should move on in terms of the time. But so a motion is adopted if it gets a majority. We've mentioned that before. Abstentions. You do not count an abstention when you are figuring out what a majority is. To abstain means not to vote. It's superfluous to ask people if they're abstaining, since someone choosing not to vote, if they don't want to tell you they're not voting, they're abstaining just as much as if they tell you that they are. Sometimes in a vote by ballot, people might write that they abstain, or they turn in a blank ballot, and that's the same thing. The report of the tellers includes those numbers if it's a ballot, but they don't affect in any way whether the motion passes or fails. People who abstain don't have to explain themselves. So again, when determining whether a motion prevails, whether a majority or 2/3 is needed, you don't take any notice whatsoever of abstentions, even if people insist on telling you they're abstaining. You do not add them to no votes to determine the number required for a motion to pass. And a tie is not a majority, so a tie is also not passing. So adopt, agree, and accept mean the same thing in Robert. Most of the time, you don't want to approve a motion to adopt an entire report, even if you really like that report, because the body would need to make sure that it approves every word, including background. Likely those reporting, like a committee with recommendations, are just asking for approval of the specific actions listed as recommendations. They're not asking you to approve the entire report. Now, how many times in your meetings have you heard a motion to, quote, receive the report? That is a waste of time. If a report was given, it was already received. Voting to do what you just did doesn't make sense. Like, for example, somebody gave a committee report, and then the moderator says, is there a motion to receive it? What if the body voted no? They've already received it according to Robert. You can't undo it. The minutes can show that reports happened without motions and votes. So if you're taking the minutes, you would say a report was given and briefly summarize that, what it said. So far, we have assumed meeting in person, though most of it is applicable to any meeting format. What about pandemic restrictions? How can Presbyterians be decent and in order online? Remember this phrase, simultaneous oral communication. People need to be able to hear one another in real time, as I mentioned before, in order to maintain the principles of fairness and full participation. And then again, can you take a vote by email without meeting? For a time-sensitive matter that's pro forma and doesn't need discussion, your rules could authorize that under certain circumstances, you can take electronic or email votes. And I would say the rules would need to say this. All members have to be notified with proper time to respond, and the resulting vote must be overwhelming, if not unanimous. But if any one member wants to discuss the matter, then you need to have a meeting. Again, because our principle is, we don't just decide things, I'm over here and you're over there, and what do I think is best? I need to hear you in order to inform my vote, and you need to hear me. So.
I did mention that there is an upcoming, a proposed amendment to help at least make that a little more clear in the Book of Order. I'm not sure if there's anything where you want to say it, or at least it speaks to it. I don't know if it makes it any clearer, but
yeah, I can't remember about electronic votes. Or about email voting, whether that is.
Oh, maybe it was just electronic meetings. Maybe it was email voting.
There is an amendment that would put in the Book of Order that electronic meetings are allowable, so we wouldn't have that problem, which we've had the last couple of years in the pandemic, that you couldn't have a legal meeting because you had to do it in person, and you couldn't meet in person, but you had to have a meeting. So I don't know, I don't recall that it said something specific about.
I think you might be right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. If you're going to have electronic meetings, though, then you do have to have standing rules that spell out how people can participate, and they're going to guard the fundamental rights of members. And there are some samples in Robert's Rules of Order. So these are the types of things that you would want to include. How are you going to do that so that people are aware of what the processes are going to be? So, of course, clerks, you're responsible for the records, including minutes of all meetings. These are the things that RO&R says should be in your minutes. And you probably already know the session can elect a clerk who's not currently serving actively in a class on the session. In that case, the clerk would certainly need voice in order to function, but wouldn't have a vote. Robert says minutes should contain mainly a record of what was done at the meeting, but not what was said by the members. And these are the things to include. Your Presbytery is going to have a checklist, I'm sure you have that, of additional requirements from the Book of Order or things that you need to do in your meetings that then you need to be in your minutes. And the main point is this: you want people looking back next year or next century to know what happened and the context of that, but you're not making a record of the debate. I don't find it written in RO&R or the Book of Order, but it is customary to list the members present in session in Presbytery meetings. And please don't refer to people by their first names only in the minutes. Even if everyone reading the record right now knows who you mean, later generations won't know that, and you don't want them to have to dig around in various places to figure out what happened way back then. You won't print the minutes for the binder you'll submit to the Presbytery for review, or sign them until they have been approved by the session. So.
Trish, I'm aware of one question that someone has sent through the chat.
Okay.
And I told them I would open up a space that they could ask it.
Of course.
Directly.
Sure.
Ellen?
Thank you. Thank you, Tricia, for this presentation. Very helpful. I wanted just to confirm, again, to see you. I had noted your point of order motion that you said probably wouldn't arise too much. I have heard it once, and I wondered if that motion is an objection to maybe an amendment being treated out of order, or if you could just briefly explain what that motion would be, the point of order motion.
A point of order is where somebody thinks, wait, from a parliamentary procedure perspective, we didn't do that correctly. Let's fix that. And some people will, for example, say, point of order, we didn't get a second. That a second is something that you actually don't, if you've gone into the conversation, then you don't have to go back and get a second, because if you're already debating it, then more than one person wants to debate it. So that's not a legitimate point of order, but it just is this needed a 2/3 vote and you said it passed with the majority. That would be a point of order. Or this motion's not in order because it's not in the right place on the chart. We can't do that right now because something else is pending. That's in the hierarchy is off.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think I saw, let's see, a chat. Is it proper to make a motion to receive the treasurer's report? If the treasurer is not there and isn't giving it, then you could do that, I suppose. But usually receive the report is for things that aren't being said already. If it's been given, then it's been received. The one exception that Robert's Rules of Order makes about receiving the report is for auditors. So auditing the treasurer's report. And then if you receive the auditor's report, then that relieves the treasurer of any responsibility if there's something wrong there. But that's because the report's been audited. But so mostly receive the report is not a thing in Robert for the most part. Yeah.
I have a quick question, Patricia. Our session is only now 4 members. What is a quorum considered to?
Well, you would need a rule, or in Robert, it's a majority. So if the session's 4, then the majority would be 3.
Right.
But your pastor is a member of the session. So if it's 4 members plus the pastor, for example, 4 elders,
right,
then a majority is still 3.
Okay,
that's a majority of 5. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
See, if a motion has been approved and new information comes up afterwards that will probably change the vote, is there a way of reconsidering? Yes. There is a chance to reconsider is a possibility. There are specific rules for it, which I didn't think we'd have time today to go over, but they're in Robert. And so there's time limits and that kind of thing. There's even a motion to rescind something previously adopted. And sometimes if the time limit for reconsidering has passed, you could rescind something that's been previously adopted as long as it hasn't started being carried out. So.
Jamie has a question for you, Tricia.
Getting back to the electronic voting, like if you're voting by email, the process that we've been using follows all of the rules that you had stated. So it's only inconsequential things. There's got to be a certain amount of notice that's given and everything that you had on your list. So I'm confused as to why, if all of those items are met, why it has to officially be voted on in a meeting, because then if people change their votes and it's not passed, what is the point of that? our process was always that it had to be reported in the session minutes, but that it would not be revoted because everyone knows what the issue is. If a single person says, no, we shouldn't vote on this, it has to be discussed in person, then we would not vote on it and all that other stuff. Why are we retaking the vote at a meeting on the chance that what's already been decided will get rescinded?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think there's anything in Robert that says that that would need to happen if you've allowed it. I wouldn't vote on it again myself. That wouldn't have been something that I would do. I can
See,
go
we
back
can
and
all
look up
learn.
I'm sorry, Steve.
I said we can all learn because I was the one who told them they did, because I had been told, because it is not a contemporaneous oral, that it's not really, it's an agreement, but it isn't an actual action according to Robert. But if that's not true, then forget I said all that.
Well, I tell you what, I've studied Robert's Rules of Order. I'm not a professional registered parliamentarian, but I passed the test for registered parliamentarian. I've done this, but I have to go look things up all the time, and including, does this need a second, or, how many people have to vote on it? I have to look it up all the time. So I think you have something else in your meeting coming up, and I am happy to go look that up in Robert and see whether Robert's Rules of Order says anything about email voting that would mean you'd have to ratify it later. I wouldn't have thought so, but I do think that you have to be very limited about when you use it. And if it isn't something that everybody's just like, if it's not a no-brainer, you shouldn't be doing it at all. Because again, very important principle, and it's not just Robert's Rules of Order, it's theological. We believe that we make decisions by listening to one another. And I mean, can the Holy Spirit move through all of us simultaneously if we're not listening to each other? I suppose so. No, you can't say God can't do that, but we believe that we listen to one another and then decide. So if it's something that isn't just, of course, we're going to allow the youth group to have a different chaperone or something like that. I mean, if it isn't something totally obvious that everybody's going to agree to, you should not take it electronically. You by email, you can have a Zoom meeting but talk about it. So and a lot of times the only reason you're doing it by email is that you need it done now so something can happen. You can't, and if you're taking a vote that you can't undo, then that doesn't make sense that you have to vote on it again because it's already happened. And you wouldn't be doing it electronically if you could wait till your session meeting, or you wouldn't be doing it by email if you could wait. So if it'd be helpful, Steve, I can turn my camera off, go look it up in Robert, and come back and put it in the chat once I see if there's anything else. That'd be helpful.
If you don't mind doing that. But there are two more people. I want to be fair to your time as well. We've gone over a little bit. Are you open to taking these last two questions, or shall we thank you for your further research? And
yeah, I tell you what, let me see my son and daughter-in-law need to leave. Let me see if my grandbaby's still in napping or not. And they keep asking. I'm gonna turn off my camera so I don't make you dizzy, and take my computer out and see whether and tell them they can leave. But I can stay.
If you're sure.
You still sleeping? Okay. All right. Ask away.
John, where?
Okay. My grandbaby's still in napping, so ask away.
Good. Thank you. Our session is 5 elders. The pastor typically does not vote. But if the pastor has the right to vote, then that would seem that a majority would be 4, not 3.
So 5 elders plus the pastor, that's 6 is That's how many people are members of that body. So the majority would be 4. Yep. Well, it depends. It's a majority of who's actually voting. So, if somebody's not there, then you don't count them in the majority. So if 4 people vote, then you need 3 to get a majority. If 6 people are voting, then you would need 4 for majority. So it depends on how many are voting.
But does that matter whether the pastor chooses to vote on a question?
No. The pastor can choose to vote. If he or she doesn't vote, then it's just the majority of whoever does. Or maybe an elder who chooses not to vote. There's a difference between a quorum and the majority and the number that's required to pass something. So a quorum is a majority, if you don't have a rule for it, is a majority of the actual people
who are
members of the body. A vote is, maybe only 3 people. You may have 6 people there, only 3 people vote, then the majority of 2 would pass that motion. Yeah. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last? If only 3 people vote?
Yeah, say there may be 6 people sitting around your session table. The pastor and 2 elders don't vote. They are abstaining.
Abstain.
Yeah, they don't have to tell you they're abstaining. They just don't vote. That means they have abstained. So 3 people voted, let's say, 2 voted in favor and 1 against. That motion still passes. Now, you in a group that small, you might want to wonder why the other 2 people didn't vote. Are they ambivalent? Is this something you all need to discuss further, etc. But technically, the vote is, if you have a quorum of the people there, it's a majority of whoever votes that passes the motion.
Right. Majority of those voting, not majority of those present.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see, I'm looking at the chat now. Are there guidelines for what needs to be brought to session for a vote versus decisions made within a committee? Now, technically, in Robert, a committee is just makes recommendations to the whole. So there's not guidelines per se. If your session thinks, well, the hospitality committee can decide if they're going to decorate the fellowship hall or not. That's not the type of thing that the session necessarily needs to vote on, but it might be your custom, or people really care about that, then it comes to the session for a vote. In presbyteries, there are some things that are delegated to, say, a committee on ministry, where they are empowered to make that decision. And in that sense, in our terminology, they have what's called commission powers. So a commission can make decisions on behalf of the presbytery, but a committee just recommends to the presbytery. Does that make sense? And one of the things, because Robert allows for smaller groups to be a lot more informal, the point being, these things are supposed to help the process. They're supposed to make sure everybody's heard. So we do it decently and in order, but it's not supposed to make it harder for you to do your ministry. It's supposed to guarantee the rights of everybody, the minority to be heard, the majority to rule. I moderated a session that voted on every committee reported, even when no action was requested. Is that correct? No. You only vote on things that are recommendations that the session, a policy or an action that the session is going to carry out. If and this is what I was saying about receiving the report. The committee reports, somebody says, I move we receive the report. The definition in Robert of receiving a report is that report got given. So when you vote to receive it, you said, I vote we do what we just did. We just heard that report. Yeah. If you vote to do it, you know, I mean, I guess it'd be weird if you voted not to receive it. What would that mean? If you already had heard it or it was in your packet to be read. Now, you might vote to receive a report, and this is in really formal bodies. If there's a report from a person or a group that comes that wasn't on the agenda and you didn't have in advance, and somebody wants to make a report, then you might vote to receive the report, meaning, okay, let that person get up and talk, or that committee. That's what receiving the report means in Robert's Rules of Order. If you've been receiving reports all these times, you know, no harm, no foul, but you don't need to. It's a waste of time. It doesn't mean anything. But we do it all the time. I've been, you know, that's one of the reasons I mention it. It's like, ooh, I didn't know that until I studied this stuff. Now I know. Don't need to do it. Anything else? All right, well, I'm going to go look up I have an electronic version of Robert's Rules of Order in my committee, in my computer, and I will go check that out and about whether you need to vote on motions taken by electronic voting. And I'll say either, oh, I learned something that I didn't think, or no, I was my assumption was correct that you do not need to vote on that again. You did need to vote to ratify decisions that were made, even not by email, but in an electronic meeting, if you didn't have rules that allow for electronic meetings, but that's because the meeting itself was technically not authorized. But we're taking care of that with the Book of Order and other rules. And by now, most of your sessions have probably adopted a rule that allows for an electronic meeting on Zoom. But that's different from an email vote. So, okay.
Tricia, you've been a great help. Thank you for your time and your wisdom and all that you brought to this. It's very much appreciated.
Happy to be with you in the Highlands, and I will I'll go look that thing up and be back in the chat. So.
And enjoy that grandbaby.
I will. She's still napping. My son and daughter-in-law are going to a football game, so they were getting ready to leave. So see y'all later.
Take care.
Yeah.
And thanks to the pastors and moderators who were joining us. I hope it was helpful to you. And my hope in inviting the moderators and pastors was, even though they have the lion's share of this work, if you know what's going on, you're a much better clerk. You're in much better position to say, wait a second, because now you know things that you might not have known before. So like all powers, we hope you'll use them responsibly, but that was my hope in having her share as much as she did. Right. So picking up where we left off, a few more items of note. In the past, you've been asked if an elder commissioner was elected. Very rarely do I see that there has been a report from the elder commissioner. If an elder goes to a presbytery meeting and no one reports on it, did it really happen? And I would say no. If they don't tell you what occurred, that is not helpful to all of you. So now it's two questions. Did you elect someone and did they report back? The electronic voting policy, which whatever Tricia comes back with, and I look forward to seeing what she has to say. The important thing is, as she said, you have to have some kind of policy that you can all turn to and say, this is how we said we would do this. And whether it's the best way or not the best way, it has to be something you all agree on. No one should be surprised to find out that something happened that was unexpected in that way. Financial accountability and transparency. On one hand, I know the pandemic made some things hard. On the other hand, I know that it is possible to get an audit done internally or externally despite a pandemic. These things are just too important. And we have the financial workshop coming up in November on the first Saturday to talk about ways in which you can do this as a congregation as well as possible. But the key thing for our purposes is the session needs to know what's happening financially. They represent the congregation in that matter. So even if your trustees handle the financial stuff, the session still has to see a report. Monthly is best. Quarterly is acceptable. Anything beyond that, you really are not showing the kind of transparency that you need to. Because by the time 6 months go by, if you do it twice a year, things will have happened. And I have been working with a church that we discovered somewhat accidentally that $30,000 had been stolen, because this is a church that's closing. So we don't have to check the records every month because there aren't any expenses. So when finally someone checked it, $30,000 was gone. Quarterly is what we're looking for, at the least.
Steve,
Yes.
can I ask a question? We get we get full financials monthly, and then we also get a distilled, little snapshot. Should I include that snapshot in my minutes?
I would say if someone's providing it to you, then it's worthwhile to put it in. Yeah.
Okay. Not the full financial. I mean, we get full financials. I mean, lots of stuff. But the snapshot is a good.
Yeah, if the snapshot covers the essentials, once a year you have to put in the full budget and a full accounting.
Right.
That part has to happen. On a monthly basis, if the snapshot is presented and people seem to understand it and it's not leaving out important bits of information, then I think the snapshot is satisfactory, yes. There's a correction that I will have to make in the next minute review, because it says we would like you to put it on paper, but I can't require you to. That's actually not true. You are required to do it on paper. The books, the session rolls, the registers, those are all there. You can order more sheets. You can use regular paper if that's what you do, because most of it is now acid-free enough that it's not an issue. But you do have to ultimately keep it on paper. So even if you have a software program that you're using, it still has to be on paper. The reality is, some of you may have in your home a Bible from someone who lived in the 1700s in your family, and you have all the family listed from the 1700s. The computers we're using now, in 20 years, we may be on to something totally different. If you remember 8-track tapes or VCR tapes, technology changes so quickly that paper does last forever. So it's now required. If you have questions on what you need to keep and how to keep that material safe, the Historical Society is loaded with information. If you're a small church, and I don't know what they qualify as a small church, you can get a $500 grant to have your records digitized, which means take your old records, they'll make a PDF of them, and they'll keep the hard copy. It's your copy. It's still yours if you want them back, but they will store them in a safe, secure place and hold on to them because they really belong to the church. But you are the holder of them as the congregation that created them. So they'll hold them for your safekeeping, but in the meanwhile, they'll give you a digital copy that you can use as long as we can use digital copies. And if you're a small church, you can get some money toward doing that because it does come at some expense. If you can imagine scanning a session minute book, that's a lot of scanning. So keep that in mind and go to the Historical Society if you have any questions. For the most part, this hasn't come up, but it has come up a couple of times. You can have a perfect session review and not have one or both of these policies, and that is a fail. And you can have these two policies and have 15 other exceptions, and it'll just be marked as 15 exceptions, but you passed. But these policies are just too critical to not have them. It's not good for your church. It's not good for your members. It's not good for the Presbytery. It's not good for the PCUSA. It's not good for the Church of Jesus Christ, because unfortunately we know things happen, and they have happened. And if you're someone who's, it's all brass tacks to you, well, your insurance company cares that you have these policies and live up to them. So when we ask for them, and as the clerk, it's your job to say, we need to have these. Well, it's a lot of work. We don't have any children. Someone brings their grandchild and something can happen. You don't want that to happen. You want to have a plan for how you're going to prevent that. And you don't have to create these things from whole cloth. There are lots of models. We can provide models. Your neighboring churches probably have these policies, and somehow make sure you have them.
Steve, do we just have to indicate that we have adopted them and they are in our manual, or do we have to include it as a copy in the minutes?
You do not need to include it as a copy in the minutes. So yes, you just have to record that you have them. It doesn't hurt when you send your minutes into Sonia, if you're sending them in electronically, to scan them and send them, and she'll save them so that we'll know you had a copy in more than just you're telling us. We'll actually have a copy if you need one. And then when you update it or whatever, you can send us the update. If you do a hard copy, if you submit your hard copy, and we have people who've done that, Sonia may well scan them because she would have access to them, but I don't know.
Yes, I scan everything that comes in.
So there you go. So if you have the policy and you haven't submitted it anytime recently, do so, and then we'll make sure we have a copy.
Steve, this is
Yes.
Donna Erickson from Hackettstown.
Hi there.
I mean, I think Sonia asked for both of those things that we sent in towards the end of last year, but I actually had one question about recording marriages.
Yes.
We are in Hackettstown. We're like 4 buildings away from David's Country Inn, where they have a lot of wedding receptions, and we have had a couple of weddings that they wanted a church wedding, and we were close by, so they recently in August and in September we had 2 weddings. They're not members or anything like that. Are those weddings recorded as well?
I need to check on that. I've actually wondered about that myself, because I believe it is said that every wedding that happens that's connected to the church. So if the pastor does it elsewhere, you have to put it in. And I don't think if it's someone who's kind of random and they're just using the space that you
basically
need to
renting it. Yeah,
right.
They brought their own pastors. I think our organist played at the second wedding, but that's been the extent of it, other than using our church.
I have generally understood it as only when it is
connected
related to the church members. So as a pastor, I do, people call and say, could you do a wedding? and they have nothing to do with the church I serve, I don't report that to the church that I did it. It was my day off and, I just did it. So I would say if you're just renting space, you do not need to.
Right. I mean, session approved them all, but,
Yeah.
I just didn't think I had to record them. I have enough trouble recording everything else without getting all that information too.
Yep, I understand. I understand.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
Steve,
Yes.
this is Barb Jones at Pilgrim. I just wanted to clarify, do these two policies need to be reviewed every year and approved by session?
No. Once you approve them, they're in force until you approve something new.
Okay.
But to remind everybody that they exist, to remind them that they aren't just something you agreed to 10 years ago and it doesn't matter anymore. That's what happens with mission statements in people's bulletins. It's like, okay, we approved it 10 years ago and nobody even knows what it is. It's bad enough with mission statements. That's too bad. With these policies, that can't happen. It just can't. 5 years from now, you shouldn't think one adult can go with one child, and that's a good idea. And so it would not hurt at all if at a meeting each year, you said, we're just going to flip through and just cover the highlights of these two policies, just so we're all on board, especially when you have new elders. You might even want to bring it up with new members because they're coming there, they're trusting the church with their kids, and you want to say, here's our policy. And then they understand that you're taking good care of your kids. You don't have to do that, but it's one of those things that it doesn't hurt if you do. It can only help that everyone knows and knows where they are, and that you're overseeing your children and youth programs and making sure they're in accordance. The session's going to approve the field trip to the zoo. The session ought to say, and how many chaperones will you have? Make sure you have enough. If you don't have enough, then maybe they help beat the bushes to get a couple people to go along, because ultimately the session is responsible for what happens.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. A number of folks have put, we're updating our policies or we're revising our policies. Just so you understand, that's different than it's in process. To me, in process means there's nothing there, we're working on it. Update and revise means we have something, it's in effect, this is what we're working under, but we're trying to fine tune it and update it. So when I see that in a minute review form, if I see in process, that means you don't have it. All of which is to say, if you don't have one, it's something you need to work on now. That's a priority. I wanted you to know, again, that we have to play by the same rules you do. We just play in a different ballpark. And so you don't have to wait for 2023 to be nearly done with your 2022 minutes. You could have them done by the end of the weekend if you wanted to. And so this is the list I keep for Highlands Presbytery because our minutes are reviewed by the Synod of the Northeast. So this is what I keep track of. And I highlighted you may have noticed time is moving fast, but it's not November yet. But I know that at the November meeting in 2022, we have to provide our plan for parity for elders. Sonia and I were just working on it. Some of you have gotten emails from us about it. So even though it hasn't happened yet, I know it's going to happen because I did that calendar that I showed you before. I know that we have, in May of this year, we had the dissolving of the congregation. So I marked it down. So now when they send their minute review form, because I know what the questions generally will be, I can just plunk all this in. I just have to go back and find the page number. So it's very simple. Once you have the page numbers in, it doesn't take much time at all if you just keep track as the year goes by. So like I said, we have to play the same game you do. We just have different readers than you do. Oh, there's Tricia. All right. Just going over some things quickly as our time is going. We will be voting on proposed amendments to the Constitution is really what that should say, although it is just the Book of Order this year. We will start in November and then we'll continue through until the May 2023 meeting. All of the results have to be into the General Assembly by July. So our May meeting is our last chance to do that unless we call a special meeting, which we do not want to do. March of 2023 is an overhaul of the rules of discipline, which will, if approved, be called church discipline after that. So that's one you might particularly want to pay attention to, but really it's the Book of Order, so to pay attention to all of them. And that's where having the elder go to the meeting and come back and say, we voted that our student pastors in the future, our interns from seminary, have to take boundary training. That was one of the votes we took in November, and that is one of the votes that will be taken in November. And so that way the elder comes back and says, we need to, this is going to happen now, we're pretty sure. We need to keep that in mind because we agreed to have an intern for next year, and we need to make sure they take boundary training. And so that's the schedule that's laid out. We may vote on as many as 11 amendments in a single meeting. I think that's true in November, but we'll be using a consent docket like we've talked about a few times today. So there are things like boundary training that now are being proposed for all sorts of people for whom it was not required before. And so instead of saying, okay, for the student intern, for the Christian educator, and voting each and every time, it's all the same motion, just calling on different people. We'll try to vote on them as one in a consent docket. And if someone says, well, I don't know why a student intern has to do this, then they pull it off and we'll vote on it separately. But it's a way to keep things moving, make sure we're efficient, because it's a lot of material to cover. But you can look forward to that happening starting next month. Hard to believe, but yes, next month. Manual of Operations has come up a lot. We have material on the website, but the big thing to remember is, anybody have an idea of how you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You guessed it. I'm sure if you weren't on silent, you'd be cracking up right now. Most of these policies require regular training and reconfirmation. Thank you, Sue. That's very helpful. And yes, this presentation, the whole thing will be out as soon as people who know technology better than I do can get it up. So the big thing with the Manual of Operations and the bylaws is don't make it so big that it's overwhelming. That isn't helpful to you or to anybody. Because if it seems like too much and you just keep putting it off, you need it. You can't keep putting it off. So one bite at a time. Which is easier to imagine doing? Writing a book or putting paper in a folder? I can tell you, I have my doctor of ministry, so I had to write a book. From personal experience, putting paper in a folder is much easier. And my guess is we all do that all the time. And that's all the Manual of Operations needs to be. Collect the things you already have, the things you should have. And all of this information is on our website right now. There's a list of things that should be in bylaws and what should be in a Manual of Operations. You should have articles of incorporation. That's something you need to have. If you don't have them, you need to contact your clerk of courts in the secular system They have a lot of that stuff. The reason I say note legal name is the first time I send you an email, it might be Stephen H. Shusett, stated clerk. We get to know each other. I'm just Steve. I have two old friends who call me Stevie, and I let them get away with it, but I wouldn't suggest you start doing that. When it's something official that I'm signing, I'm Reverend Dr. Stephen H. Shusett. But on my passport, it has to say Stephen Harold Shusett because that's what's on my birth certificate. What does that have to do with you and your church? The church that I was working with, that I mentioned with the $30,000 theft, it's in the process of closing. Well, one of the things we had to do was provide our corporate name. And what I discovered is the clerk of courts goes by the name they've been given. You could be the First Presbyterian Church of East Overshoe, or you might be First Presbyterian Church of East Overshoe, or the First Presbyterian Church of East Overshoe, or East Overshoe Presbyterian Church. And the people around you call it First Pres and all those other things. But when you have to do something legally, you only have one name. So you need to make sure you have it and have it right. It doesn't matter what you do normally, but you got to know what the legal name is. And believe me, it is, if you put in the wrong name, it can be a nightmare. In our case, as Presbyterians, many of us are First Presbyterian of somewhere, or somewhere Presbyterian Church. It's a little more helpful because it has the place name, but the truth is, you're in Hackettstown, and maybe you're First PC of Hackettstown. But 150 years ago, there may have been another church in Hackettstown that none of us know about now. And so for the clerk, they aren't going to know which one you are unless you give them the right name. You'll want your bylaws. You want those policies we've talked about. You want to have in there how you approve of electronic meetings, your employment policies, weddings, funerals, building use, anything that is a policy that's been approved by your session needs to be in that folder. But that means you might have 15 documents that are stapled in the left-hand corner in a folder. That is your manual of operations. It doesn't have to be written out so that it flows so smoothly and it's all the same font and all that stuff. That's nice. And if you have time, knock yourself out, do it. The important thing is you have this manual, and when something happens, you know exactly where it is. Exactly. And so for those of you that said it would take more than 30 minutes to get your session minutes, I understand that. Some of you may keep them in a locked safe, and it might take 30 minutes to open the combination on the lock. That's okay. You do what you got to do. Rarely is that urgent. The manual of operations, you should be able to find it in minutes. Even if you're at home, you should have a copy. And as a bonus, if you have a copy of the original charter and original membership, that's a good thing to have in your manual of operations. It isn't required, but it's a helpful document to have readily available. Strangely enough, it does come up occasionally. For the manual, getting to know you, part 2. We ask in the minutes, what is the term for the clerk of session and the treasurer? So you have to define, is it 1 year? Is it 3 years? Is it 2 years? How often does the session meet? How many people are on session? Some sessions can be the deacons or the trustees or both. State that up front for the manual. What are all of your official committees? What are their responsibilities? You don't want to blame the worship committee for not being ready with the Easter breakfast if that's not their responsibility. So everybody needs to know what their job is. And it's nice when people can do more, but it's hard enough just to do what you're responsible for. And one of the things we're looking to talk about with all of the churches over the next few months, Presbytery leader Gene Raddick and I, is that a lot of churches operate like they still have the same membership they had 20 years ago. And God bless you if indeed that's the case. But many churches are different than they were 20 or 30 years ago, 50 years ago. But we've always had these committees. Well, maybe your committees, you have more committees than you need. Maybe you can combine some of them. When I ask how is the leadership of each committee determined, a lot of churches say, you're an elder on session, so you're in charge of this committee. And that works for a lot of folks. But the truth is that means that person has two committee responsibilities: the session, which is a committee, and the committee they're assigned to. Could they just be on that committee and not in charge of that committee? Could they be a liaison with that committee and never even go to that committee meeting and just report back from that committee? Those are all possible. So you need to say right up front in your manual, this is how we do it. And if you change your mind, great. If you don't change your mind, great. But everybody needs to know what's going on. Everyone needs to be on the same page. And it can make a big difference then when you are seeking to staff committees or call elders and they're like, you mean I have to go to a meeting on the first Tuesday and then I have to go to a meeting on the first Wednesday because that's when the fellowship committee meets? I don't know if I want to do that. That's a lot. And it is. Some churches, they manage. Other churches are finding it hard to get people to serve. Those are things to think about. But we'll, like I said, be talking about that as time goes by. You can leave now knowing you learned a little Greek. I'm sure that'll make your day. But all that means is I found it. Here's the manual of operations dated today. You can have electronic copies. You can have electronic copies on multiple computers. That multiple computers might be because every elder gets an electronic copy. You want to make sure everybody knows how to find it because yes, you're the clerk, but sometimes you're allowed to be on vacation. You're allowed to be sick. You're allowed to turn your phone off. So everybody should be able to find it without bugging you. And you want to have paper copies in a bunch of places. In your safe that takes 30 minutes to open, in the file cabinet so everybody can just go, oh, it's in that file drawer. We all know where it is. Maybe even have a label on it saying manual operations, safety deposit box, because if something happens to your church building, you may not be able to get in there, but you could go to the safety deposit box. You can send an electronic copy to Sonia and she will make sure it's safe and secure so that if there's that kind of an emergency and nobody can get to the safety deposit box, she can send it to you. And you want to make sure you put a date on everything because over the years, is it this sexual misconduct policy we're using now or that sexual misconduct policy? I don't know. Let's compare. There's no reason to be that caught up in things. If you can just put a date on it so that everybody goes, okay, in January, we said we have a sexual misconduct policy dated May 2019. So we know this is the most recent one because that's the only one we are referring to. Simple. And we do have the handbook for clerks. It's on the website. We just updated it recently. Not hugely, but we did put some electronic voting, email voting material in there. So if you don't have a policy on that yet, you'll have something to work with. It's a bigger document, so going through it would be, well, we could spend 3 hours doing that if we wanted to. So I'll trust you to look at it, to read it, to fire your questions, and I'm sure it will cover a lot of ground for you. And that's it. Let me stop sharing. So thank you for your patience with all this. Does anybody have any particular questions? That I see some things in the chat. I don't know if one's from Trisha. Let's see. Oh, wow. Some long ones. I don't find, oh, Trisha says, I don't find anything in Roberts about having to vote to ratify a decision made by email voting, but such voting is discouraged. So I would only use it if absolutely necessary, and there's no chance whatever that anyone will object. Did you send that to all of us? Yes. So if you look in your chat, she actually puts the citation in there so you can see what is understood by Roberts. So, like I said, we can all learn, we can all be corrected. I learned several new things today. That's just one of them. Bill asks, who is the contacted Presbytery? Should you have a question? I would say start with me, but there are times when I refer to Sonia, depending on what the question is. But start with me as the stated clerk, and we'll go from there. Is the clerk responsible for creating the manual? Who is responsible for preparing the session docket? You are not, well, you would be involved in creating the manual. Yes, you would be a part of it. Often the clerk is the one who leads a team that does that when that's required. But if there are things that you have, you can just put them in the folder, and you're doing it. If there are things you have to create new, get other people to work with you, because you're ultimately going to have the session and maybe the congregation approve it, and you don't want to be responsible for all of that. When it comes to the docket, I have always preferred to work as a pastor with this clerk of session, that we do it together, because you help me remember, oh, it's January and we need to put my terms of call in, because I might not remember that. So responsible, ultimately the pastor is the moderator, so they're responsible. But if they're smart, they will ask you to help. And if they're not that smart, you can tell them that I said they would be smarter if they asked you to help.
Okay.
Who completes the terms of call worksheet? If you have a personnel committee, they would do it. If not, the session can do it. You're the official signature. I haven't looked at that form recently. Someone has to sign it. Normally, you would be the one to sign all official documents. So the completion may not be you, but the signing is probably you.
Yeah, my question really arises from the fact that I had committees punt and give it to me, and I'm like, no, I'm not a math person. I'm a words person. I agree that I am the signer, yes, but I think personnel is probably more suited to doing that with the calculations of salary and other benefits. So I agree. Thank you for clarifying that.
When the recording of this is up, you can jot down that quotation about being able to say that, you know, I can do this and I can't do that, and that's okay. Yeah, that's not your job. You're not the receptacle of all things nobody else wants to do.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Well, it's been a full morning. Thank you for your time on this. Next year, we'll take a different approach to how we cover what clerks do and at this point don't do. And we'll try to find someone else from General Assembly who can speak to some of the things you would be interested in. If you think of questions down the road, don't hesitate to call Sonia or I, or email us. And if it's a question for her, I'll pass it on to her. And I've learned if she has a question that she thinks is for me, she will let me know. thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day. I see it's supposed to rain a lot tomorrow, but I hope you have a not so rainy day today. Let's close with a quick prayer. Thank you. Holy God, please bless these your servants who have committed so much time and energy and service to your church. Bless them with the confidence to know that you are with them in every step of the way, and that you have given them a church on which they can rely. May we all work together in your vineyard, blessed by your grace. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.
Thank you.
Blessings, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.